If you haven't heard about Anchor, it is the easiest way to make a podcast. Please, let me explain. 1, it is free. 2, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from the phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many, many others. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It is everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So please, download the free Anchor app and go to anchor.fm and get started today.
The Ear, Evangelical and Reformed Christian Podcast. Welcome to The Ear, the Evangelical and Reformed, a Christian podcast that urges you to think deeper and draws you closer to God through faith. Through powerful sermons, teaching segments, and discussions, The Ear hopes to give you a different perspective on secular topics from a Christian worldview. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Please welcome your host, Brandon Queen.
Somebody gave great advice one time, and they said, find whatever God is already doing and get involved in that. You know, if God is obviously working in a certain way, get right in the middle of it.
Are you one of those church members that compare the new pastor to the old pastor? Do you make it completely hard for the new pastor to unfold his vision due to your old school mentality? Do you make the up-and-comer feel that he is not welcome at your church because you follow the old pastor? Newsflash, you should follow Christ.
Yeah. Nobody should aspire to be the guy who incites division in the church. That's not a spiritual gift. Anyone who tries to foster rivalries or divisions on purpose, and here's the sad truth, Brandon, some people really love that stuff. They love to get caught up in it.
Those who come alongside after the previous pastor or leader have the difficulty of comparison, even if the other person has died. Perhaps even in a family relationship, we are living in someone else's shadows, like a second husband to the widow, a stepmother after a divorce, or a new girlfriend in a dating relationship. Tune in to this teaching segment as we learn how the Church of Corinth suffered due to their differences and how Apollos responded. Well, good morning, Podcast World, and welcome back to episode 6 of season 5, Unknown, entitled Apollos, the Up-and-Comer. Last week, we talked about Priscilla and Aquila and their role in training and bringing up Apollos in the right way and the understanding of God. So this week, we're going to talk about him, and we have our author of the book, Matthew Everhard, with us, and we're going to just talk about Apollos and see what his role was alongside Paul. So what's up, Matt?
What's up, Brandon Queen, the podcast king? How are you? Good to be back on the show.
I am good. I think I'm actually going to end up using that now.
You have to.
You're definitely going to be referred to as Pastor Beard.
Okay.
You still have gray hair in your beard?
Oh, yeah, plenty.
Okay, so I'll call you Pastor Graybeard.
Yep, that's it.
All right. So, Apollos. Who is he?
Well, we met Apollos a little bit last week in our discussion with Priscilla and Aquila, and like most of the characters that we're studying in the book Unknown, he seems to be one of the people that's in a small inner circle of ministers, believers, preachers, all related to the Apostle Paul in some way. And Apollos we meet in Acts chapter 18, verses 24 to 28, which we can read in a moment. But he also shows up as sort of an important figure in the book of 1 Corinthians. And he does come up at least one more time in Paul's letter to Titus.
Okay. All right. So what do you think his purpose was? What was his purpose?
Well, let's go ahead and read the main paragraph about Apollos, which is this Acts chapter 18, 24 and following paragraph. and we'll learn a little bit more about him, okay?
All right, let me grab my Bible.
It says, all right, sounds good. So Acts 18:24, it says, "Now a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was an eloquent man, competent in the Scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things concerning Jesus, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, but when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wished to cross to Achaia, the brothers encouraged him and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. When he arrived, he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, showing by the Scriptures that Christ was Jesus, that the Christ was Jesus." So here's what we know about him. We know he's Jewish. We know his name is Apollos, which is a little bit unusual because it probably comes from the name of a Greek god, Apollo, from, Greek and Roman mythological beliefs. But we're told that he was an eloquent man, which means he was a good speaker. He was competent in the Scriptures, which means he knew the Old Testament. And because he came from the city of Alexandria, that's kind of an important detail, because Alexandria is somewhat like how we might think of Cambridge or Oxford University today. It was the center of learning. People came from all over to study in Alexandria, and they had a great library of scrolls and other books. And Alexandria is the city from whence people like Origen, the early church theologian, and even Euclid, the great mathematician, we call it Euclidean geometry today, came from that city of Alexandria. So that explains why he's such a learned individual. But he certainly has a heart for the Lord, and Priscilla and Aquila are able to teach him and instruct him and basically amplify his already great learning as they clarify more about the gospel to Apollos.
That's amazing. That's awesome. So after Apollos was corrected by Priscilla and Aquila about, learning about God more accurately, Paul installed him as a pastor at the Church of Corinth. What challenges do you think Apollos faced, and why did he face those challenges?
Well, he's clearly a talented guy, and I particularly am drawn to the character of Apollos, and like many of the characters in this book, wish we knew a little bit more about him. Love the fact that Scripture says he's fervent in the Spirit. Love the fact that he's eloquent. I love the verse where it says he greatly helped those who through grace had believed, so he's a helpful pastor. And at some point, he comes to the city of Corinth to be their minister. Now, one thing that we should probably say about the early church pastors is, whereas we think of pastors today as a guy who has a particular job at a church and may stay there for many years. My predecessor, for instance, was at Gospel Fellowship for 26 years. But it seems more like the case in the very early church that pastors sort of moved about quite a bit. Paul himself, we know he stays at Ephesus for 2 years, but most of the time Paul's moving about, planting churches and preaching the gospel. And so at some point, Apollos came to the church at Corinth that Paul had himself planted, and that's where the drama begins for the minister Apollos, because apparently in the city of Corinth and the Christian church there was some division. It seems as though some preferences began to develop between some who liked Paul better, others who liked Apollos. A third group says they like Peter, and another group says, well, we're holier than all of you. We just like Jesus the best. And Paul has to correct the church of Corinth with some very serious words throughout the letter, but especially in chapter 1 and chapter 3. He even accuses them of jealousy and strife and acting in a fleshly way, so like as unbelievers would act about these matters. And so apparently there was quite a tension in the city of Corinth, and Apollos was unfortunately caught up in that. Now, how much it was his fault, I do not know, but everywhere else he's mentioned positively. So it just seems as though he had the unfortunate challenge of ministering to a cantankerous church that Paul has to rebuke for a number of reasons in the Corinthian letters.
Well, yeah, I see that happen a lot. You just said your predecessor was with you, or I'm sorry, with your church for 26 years.
Yeah.
If you're listening in, are you one of those church members that compare the new pastor to the old pastor? And I ask that question because you never know how much stress you can add to the new pastor's plate. So this new pastor's coming in, and he's having to learn everybody, meet everybody, and get to know how everything works at the church without dramatically changing how everything was for 26 years to implement his own system, if you will. So I've seen it happen, I've seen it happen where my pastor, when he got there, he was compared to the old guy. And a lot of us like the old guy, but at the same time, a lot of us like the new guy too. And, you kind of had that church division, like, oh, I'm going to stay with the old pastor because he was best and all that good stuff.
Yeah, as a pastor myself, it's kind of pick your poison between whether you'd rather follow a guy who's great and wonderful or one who totally messes up before you. Because if you follow the guy who messed up a lot, then you have a big mess to clean up, and there's probably a lot of damage that's been done. Things aren't in the right order, the right stuff hasn't been taught, a lot of feelings are hurt. And so you follow a guy who's kind of a mess, you've got a lot of cleanup on aisle 6 to do. But then again, if you follow a guy who's wonderful, then it's hard to live up to his reputation. And as we say, they leave big shoes to fill, and that's a challenge. But I suppose it's better for the church, for a healthy transition. And even if the pastor has to kind of put up with some comparison, hopefully that only serves to cut down our pride in our hearts and to raise the bar, challenge us to pursue good things. I know here at Gospel Fellowship, I have the privilege of coming after 2 men who both served the church for over 25 years or so each. Both of them had excellent reputations, which I'm thankful for, and both of them are still very much spoken about, their influence in a good way at Gospel Fellowship. So for me, while that can come across as like, oh man, what a challenge, how am I ever going to live up to this? Yet it also serves to put a high bar, to challenge myself and say, man, I want to be one of those guys who serves faithfully for a very long time and doesn't disappoint. It's a good challenge, I suppose.
Right. I mean, no disrespect, Matt. They're not going to remember you. They're going to remember the beard. I mean, come on. Come on.
That's right. Yeah, for sure.
And another question I want to ask my listeners, because you mentioned that Paul corrected the church in Corinth with the words of jealousy and strife. Do you, the congregation or the church member, do you make it completely hard for the new pastor to unfold his vision due to your old school mentality? And that's a vital question for the congregation, because the question is, you've learned under one guy or 2 people for the course of 50 years per se. And now you have this young suave cat coming in that, wants to change the order of things a little bit, but you're not giving him a chance to develop and get into that role and be your pastor because you're stuck on old school mentality. Are you going to be that church member that does that? Or are you going to be that church member that's submissive in a way that allows God to move and do what he needs to do within that church? So think about that. All right. Yeah. Nobody should aspire to be the guy who incites division in the church. That's not a spiritual gift. Anyone who tries to foster rivalries or divisions on purpose. And, here's a sad truth, Brandon. Some people really love that stuff. They love to get caught up in it. They love to banter back and forth on email. They love to write subtweets on social media. They love to gossip. And man, what a terrible position to find yourself in a church like that, where people are constantly, biting at each other. And apparently that's what was going on in Corinth. And even though they've been extremely blessed to have, come on, man, you had Paul as your founding pastor,
and you had Apollos as the guy who followed him. I mean, that's